Millionaire dad watches Waitress feed his disabled son and changes her life forever. The clink of cutlery echoed like thunder in Alistair Blackwood's ears, each sound a needle pricking his frayed patience. From across the diner he stared, rigid, silent, as a waitress crouched beside his son, Daniel. Not just serving him, no, she was feeding him. Gently, reverently. A piece of grilled cheese lifted to trembling lips as though it were communion. Strangers watched, some with pity, some with curiosity. But to Alistair, it was a spectacle, a cruel spotlight on the one thing he couldn't control: his son's frailty, his own failure. Her scuffed shoes, her tattered uniform. They only made it worse. He wasn't about to be anyone's charity case. Not again. He reached for his wallet, leather cold against his palm. Money could fix this. It always did. Or so he told himself. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this community come together. If you enjoy powerful stories, subscribe and hit the bell. Now let's dive in. Alistair Blackwood was a man sculpted from granite and ambition, his edges sharpened by the ruthless calculus of high finance. His name was a fixture in the financial pages, a byword for aggressive takeovers and astronomical profits. His fortune was a monument to a ruthless and unwavering focus, a testament to a life lived in the pursuit of absolute control. He lived in a world of clean lines and predictable outcomes, a sterile empire of glass and steel where every variable could be quantified, managed, and bent to his will. His son, Daniel, was the one equation he could never solve, the one variable that defied every one of his attempts at control. At 17, Daniel was trapped in a body that had betrayed him since a childhood accident left him with severe cerebral palsy. His mind was a brilliant, vibrant thing, a caged bird beating its wings against the bars of his uncooperative limbs. His speech was a frustrating puzzle of slurred syllables and labored breaths, a constant source of agony for the boy and a torment of impatience for his father. For Alistair, Daniel was a constant, painful reminder of his own limitations, a deep, undeniable crack in the perfect, polished facade of his life. He loved his son with a fierce, possessive ache, a love so profound it terrified him. But it was a love suffocated by pride, a love chained to a deep-seated pathological fear of weakness in any form, especially within his own bloodline. The diner, a place called the Corner Booth, was a necessary evil, a monthly pilgrimage of discomfort. It was the only place on their long drive to a specialized neurological clinic in another state that Daniel genuinely, openly enjoyed. The boy, in his frustratingly simple way, loved the chaotic energy, the smell of frying bacon mingling with burnt coffee, and the unpretentious democratic hum of ordinary life. For Alistair, it was an hour of purgatory. He hated the sticky menus, the chipped coffee mugs that felt unclean in his hands, and most of all, the way people's eyes would linger on Daniel's wheelchair, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity that felt like a physical assault. The waitress was new. He hadn't seen her on their previous half-dozen visits. Her name tag, slightly askew, read Lena. She had tired eyes, deep-set and shadowed, but they held a flicker of something bright and resilient, a stubborn light that refused to be extinguished. When she first approached their table, Alistair had given her his usual clipped, dismissive order for a black coffee, a clear, unspoken signal that he wanted minimal interaction, a swift and efficient transaction. But Lena hadn't taken the hint. She had smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips, not at him, but directly at Daniel. "What's good today, boss?" she'd asked the boy, her voice warm and direct, stripped of the condescending, high-pitched tone most people used with him. She spoke to him as if he were an equal, an old friend. Daniel had struggled to form a response, his mouth working to shape the words, a low, frustrated sound escaping his lips. Alistair had felt a familiar surge of irritation, a hot wave of impatience that was quickly followed by a cold tide of shame. He hated this part. The awkward, gaping pause while strangers tried to decipher his son's speech, their faces a mask of strained politeness. He was about to cut in, to order for Daniel as he always did, to smooth over the uncomfortable moment and restore efficiency. But Lena held up a hand, a small, gentle gesture of patience, her fingers stained with a little ink. "Take your time," she said, her eyes never leaving Daniel's, her focus absolute. "I'm not going anywhere. The world can wait." And so, Alistair watched, a silent, seething observer, as his son, with a painstaking, heroic effort that made Alistair's chest tighten, managed to articulate his order for a chocolate milkshake and a grilled cheese sandwich. And Lena had listened, truly listened, nodding along, her head tilted, as if he were reciting poetry, as if his garbled words were the most important thing she would hear all day. It was an intimacy that felt like an intrusion, a secret connection forged in a language of patience that Alistair had never bothered, or perhaps never dared, to learn. Now, as Lena fed his son, cutting the sandwich into small, manageable pieces and wiping a stray crumb from his lip, Alistair felt that intrusion sharpen into a direct threat. He saw it as a judgment on his own fatherhood, a silent, damning accusation of his own impatience and emotional distance. He saw her kindness not as a virtue, but as a weapon, a carefully calculated tool to extract a bigger tip, to play on the sympathy of the wealthy man with the disabled son. He was a man who understood transactions, who saw the hidden ledger in every human interaction. And this, in his mind, was just another one. He would make his move, re-establish control, and put this woman and her performative compassion back in her place. Alistair waited, a predator coiled in the cracked vinyl booth, until Lena had wiped a stray bit of cheese from Daniel's chin and shared a quiet laugh with the boy over some whispered joke. The sight of it, so natural and unforced, the easy joy on his son's face, was like a stone in his shoe, a constant irritating pressure. He cleared his throat, a sound as sharp and commanding as a gavel striking oak. It was a sound that had silenced boardrooms. Lena looked up, her smile fading slightly as she met his cold, imperious gaze. "Can I get you anything else, sir? More coffee? Your time," Alistair said, his voice low and flat, stripped of all warmth. He slid a crisp, new $100 bill from his wallet and pushed it across the sticky table. The green of the note was a stark, jarring contrast to the faded Formica. "I appreciate your service, but I'll take it from here. Take it." The implication was clear, crude, and intentional. "Here is your payment for the performance. Now leave us alone." It was a dismissal, a transaction designed to demean and subordinate. Lena looked at the money, her eyes lingering on it for a moment, then back at Alistair. She didn't touch the bill. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Not anger, as he'd expected, but something closer to disappointment, a quiet sadness that irritated him even more. "I'm just helping him eat his lunch," she said, her voice even, refusing to accept the terms of his transaction. "It's part of my job. We help customers who need it." "Your job is to take orders and bring food," Alistair countered, his tone hardening, each word a carefully polished stone of condescension. "What you're doing is unnecessary. It's drawing attention." "He asked for my help," Lena replied simply, her gaze shifting back to Daniel, pointedly excluding Alistair from their shared world. "Didn't you, Danny?" Daniel, who had been watching the exchange with anxious, darting eyes, gave a small, jerky nod, his loyalty clear. The use of the nickname, so casual and achingly familiar, grated on Alistair's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. It was a claim of intimacy he had no right to. "His name is Daniel," Alistair snapped, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "And I am perfectly capable of assisting my own son." It was a lie, and a bitter, hollow one. He wasn't capable. Not really. He had nurses for that, a team of highly paid professionals who handled the messy, intimate details of Daniel's care. He provided, he managed, he directed from a distance. He didn't do. The few times he'd tried, in the privacy of their sterile, silent home, his own frustration and visceral clumsiness had made the situation worse, leaving both him and Daniel feeling defeated, a gulf of unspoken failure between them. Lena picked up another piece of the sandwich, her movements unhurried. "I'm sure you are," she said, her voice soft but with an edge of steel that caught him completely off guard. "But right now, I'm the one with the sandwich, and he's the one who's hungry." She fed the piece to Daniel, her movements fluid and practiced, a simple, irrefutable act of care. It was a checkmate delivered with a piece of grilled cheese. Alistair was left speechless, the $100 bill lying between them like a surrender flag he had foolishly, arrogantly offered. He was a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, who could bend corporate boards and international markets to his will with a single phone call. Yet in this greasy spoon diner, he had been utterly, comprehensively disarmed by a waitress who refused to play by his rules, who refused to be bought. He felt a flush of anger, hot and potent. He could have made a scene. The thought was a satisfying flash of power. He could have demanded to see the manager, a man he could see in the back, sweating over a grill. He could have her fired, her life disrupted, all with a few well-chosen cutting words. But then, he looked at his son. Daniel was watching him, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. "Don't, Dad. Please, don't ruin this." Alistair leaned back in the booth, the vinyl groaning under his weight, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He withdrew the $100 bill, the crisp paper now feeling flimsy and useless in his hand. He had tried to control the situation with the only tool he truly understood: money. And he had failed, spectacularly. For the rest of the meal, he sat in a storm of silent, impotent fury, watching as Lena and Daniel shared a world that was utterly closed to him. She didn't just feed him, she talked to him, asked him about his day, about the clinic, about a movie he'd seen, and she listened with an intensity, a focused presence that Alistair knew, with a fresh stab of guilt, he rarely gave his own son. When it was time to leave, Alistair paid the bill at the register, the exact amount, down to the cent, and in a final petty act of defiance, left a deliberately insulting tip on the table. A single, folded dollar bill. It was a childish, spiteful gesture. And he knew it. It was a final attempt to assert his dominance, to leave a sting, to have the last word. As he wheeled Daniel toward the door, pushing the chair with more force than necessary, Lena's voice stopped him. "Sir?" He turned, his body tensing, expecting a confrontation, perhaps even welcoming it as a release for his coiled frustration. "You forgot this," she said, her voice calm and steady. She held out the single dollar bill between her thumb and forefinger, as if it were a contaminated object. "I think you need it more than I do." She didn't wait for a response. She placed the dollar on a nearby empty table, its surface gleaming with a recent wipe-down, and walked away, back to her work, leaving Alistair standing in the middle of the diner, the weight of her quiet, unassailable dignity pressing down on him far more heavily than any outburst ever could. The humiliation was absolute, a cold, creeping sensation that settled deep in his bones. It wasn't just that she had refused his money, she had rejected his entire value system, the very foundation of his power, and she had done it in front of his son. The monthly drive to the clinic, once a tedious chore, became a source of active dread for Alistair. It wasn't the sterile corridors or the pitying glances of other parents that he feared anymore. It was the corner booth and the ghost of his humiliation. Daniel, however, seemed to come alive as they approached the small, unremarkable town. On their next visit, a month later, Alistair's plan was simple. He would drive right past, feign ignorance, and find some other, less humiliating place to eat. A sterile, predictable chain restaurant where the staff were trained to be anonymous and transactions were blessedly impersonal. "Dad, we're passing it," Daniel said, his voice strained with a rare and potent disappointment, his words clearer than usual. He pointed a trembling finger out the window. "They're probably busy, son. It's the lunch rush. We'll find somewhere else, somewhere quicker." It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. "No," Daniel insisted, his voice stronger, more forceful than Alistair had heard it in years. "I want to go there. I want to see Lena." The way he said her name, with such simple, unadorned affection and hope, twisted something sharp and painful in Alistair's chest. With a sigh of defeat, he pulled the car into the diner's gravel parking lot, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. He felt like a general walking into a battle he had already comprehensively lost. Lena was there. And she greeted Daniel with a smile that was pure, unadulterated sunshine, a smile that seemed to momentarily erase the exhaustion from her face. She didn't even glance at Alistair, rendering him completely invisible. The meal was a painful repeat of the last, a quiet, intricate ballet of care between Lena and Daniel that excluded him entirely. He sat in silence, a king in exile, stewing in his own irrelevance. He tried to work on his phone, to project an air of bored, unassailable importance, but he found his eyes drawn back to them again and again. He was witnessing a connection he couldn't buy, couldn't control, and most damningly, couldn't understand. Determined to reassert himself, to dig under her skin and find a weakness, he decided on a new, crueler tactic. He would uncover her angle. Everyone had one. He waited until Daniel was happily preoccupied with a coloring page of a stegosaurus that Lena had given him, then walked with feigned casualness to the counter where she was refilling salt shakers with a small metal funnel. "You know," he began, his voice laced with a condescending, faux casual curiosity, "you're very good at this. The whole caring waitress routine. You must do very well in tips from the right kind of people." Lena didn't look up from her work, the tiny crystals of salt whispering into the shaker. "I get by." "I'm sure you do." Alistair pressed on, leaning against the counter, invading her space. "A pretty young woman like you, showing a little extra attention to the right customers. It's a smart strategy. Find the lonely ones, the vulnerable ones, and play the part." She finally stopped, placing the salt shaker down with a soft, deliberate click. She looked at him, her gaze so direct and clear it was disarming, stripping away his layers of sarcasm. "Is that what you think this is? A strategy?" "Everything is a strategy," Alistair said with a dismissive shrug, the cynical mantra of his life. "It's just a matter of figuring out the endgame. So what's yours? You hoping for a handout? A sob story about your student loans, your sick mother, a down payment for a car? Let's cut to the chase." He was being cruel, deliberately so. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to see a crack in her infuriatingly calm facade, to force her down to his level. Lena's expression didn't change, but a profound, deep-seated sadness entered her eyes, extinguishing the resilient light he'd noticed before. "My endgame," she said, her voice barely a whisper, so quiet he had to lean in to hear it over the diner's hum, "is to get through my shift without crying in the walk-in freezer. My endgame is to make enough money to buy groceries for the week without having to put something back at the checkout. My endgame is to feel, for just a few minutes, like I'm making a small positive difference in someone's day." She picked up another shaker, her hand trembling slightly. "You see your son over there? The one you can't bear to look at for more than a few seconds without flinching? He's my endgame. Everything is for him." Alistair felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The words were a quiet rebuke, but they landed like a physical blow. "Your son?" he asked, confused, his own line of attack forgotten. "You have a son?" Lena finally turned to face him fully, her body language shifting from defensive to something much more vulnerable. "I had a son," she corrected, her voice trembling, the dam of her composure beginning to crack. His name was Leo. He would have been 17 this year. Just like Daniel. The air left Alistair's lungs in a sudden, sharp rush. The noise of the diner, the clatter of plates, and the murmur of conversation, all of it faded into a dull, distant roar. He felt dizzy, unmoored. Leo was in an accident when he was a little boy, Lena continued, her eyes now locked on his, holding him captive in the force field of her grief. A car accident. He was never the same. He couldn't walk. He couldn't feed himself. For 10 years, I did everything for him. But his smile could light up a whole room. She took a shaky, hitching breath. He passed away 2 years ago. An infection. His lungs just gave out. It was... Quick, she glanced over at Daniel, who was now carefully, painstakingly coloring in the cartoon dinosaur. His tongue stuck out in concentration. A genuine, tender smile touched her lips. A smile of pure, unadulterated memory. When I see your son, I see my Leo. I see the same frustration in his eyes, the same stubborn fight. And when I help him, when I cut up his food or just talk to him, it feels like I'm getting to have one more lunch with my boy. The truth of it hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow, knocking the arrogance and cynicism right out of him. This wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a performance. It was a ghost. It was a mother's love, raw and bleeding and desperate, reaching out for a connection that had been stolen from her. And he, in his monumental arrogance and pride, had mistaken it for a hustle. He looked back at his own son, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't see a symbol of his own failure or a source of public shame. He saw a boy who had, by some cosmic chance, found a moment of grace, a moment of profound connection with someone who understood his struggle in a way Alistair never could. Then, Lena delivered the final, devastating blow, her voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with a significance that Alistair couldn't yet comprehend. A whisper that would echo in his soul forever. "The accident that took my Leo's future," she said, her eyes boring into his, unknowingly accusing. "It was a hit and run, on a rainy night on the old highway just outside the city. 10 years ago. The driver was in a black sedan. A custom model, the police said. Imported. They never found him. They never even found a witness." Alistair's blood ran cold, turning to ice in his veins. A black sedan. A rainy night. The old highway. 10 years ago. The details swirled in his mind like a black vortex, pulling a memory from the deep, dark, locked recesses of his past. A memory he had buried under a mountain of money, lawyers, and willful denial. A night he had convinced himself was just a bad dream, a bump in the road, a close call. He remembered the jolt, the sickening resonant thud that vibrated through the frame of the car. He'd told himself it was a deer. He'd been drinking, celebrating a major acquisition that had made him a billionaire. He hadn't stopped. He couldn't risk it. The scandal, the press, the breathalyzer, the damage to his empire just as it was reaching its zenith. He had just kept driving, his heart hammering against his ribs, his knuckles white on the wheel, and had never, ever looked back. He stared at Lena, at the profound, unknowing grief in her eyes, and the world tilted on its axis. He hadn't just witnessed an act of kindness, he had stumbled upon the living, breathing wreckage of his own darkest secret. The woman who was showing his son a compassion he was incapable of giving was the same woman whose life he had irrevocably, unthinkably shattered. His secret, the one he thought was buried forever, was standing right in front of him, serving him coffee and feeding his child. The drive to the clinic was a blur of rain-streaked asphalt and distorted reality. Alistair's hands, usually so steady on the wheel, trembled uncontrollably. The road ahead seemed to warp and twist, every shadow on the pavement a phantom of that rainy night a decade ago. Lena's words echoed in his head, a relentless damning chorus, a black sedan, a custom model. They never found him. He wasn't just a millionaire dad watching a waitress with a flicker of annoyance. He was a killer, sitting across from the mother of the boy he had struck down and left for dead on the side of a desolate highway. The irony was so cruel, so grotesquely poetic. It felt like something out of a Greek tragedy orchestrated by a vengeful god. The universe wasn't just punishing him, it was mocking him with a masterpiece of cosmic cruelty. At the clinic, he went through the motions like an automaton, his mind 1,000 miles away, trapped in the spinning wreckage of his past. The doctor's words, the sterile smell of the examination room, the quiet hum of medical equipment, it was all background noise to the roaring inferno of his guilt. He looked at Daniel, at his own son, whose life had been so profoundly altered by a cruel twist of fate, and all he could see was Leo. He saw the future he had stolen, the years of struggle and unimaginable pain he had inflicted on Lena. His own suffering over Daniel's condition, which had once felt so monumental, so central to his existence, suddenly felt hollow and pathetic. A selfish indulgence in the face of the utter devastation he had wrought. He knew he couldn't go back to the diner. Not now. Not ever. The thought of facing Lena again, of looking into her grief-stricken eyes, knowing what he knew, was unbearable. He would find another route, another clinic, another state if he had to. He would do what he always did. Run. Bury the problem in money and distance. But as he was loading Daniel back into the car, a slow, arduous process, his son spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Is Lena going to be okay?" The question was so innocent, so full of genuine, unselfish concern, it was like a knife twisting in Alistair's ribs. "What do you mean, son?" he managed to ask, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "She seemed sad today," Daniel said, his words slow but precise. "Sadder than usual, after she talked to you at the counter." Alistair froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. Daniel had seen. Of course he had seen. He had sensed the shift, the dark, toxic undercurrent that had passed between him and Lena. His son, who struggled with so much, who the world so often dismissed, possessed an emotional clarity, an empathetic intelligence that he, with all his worldly success and power, sorely lacked. In that moment, standing in the sterile quiet of the clinic parking garage, Alistair saw his life laid out before him, a long, lonely, gilded road paved with secrets and evasions. He could keep running, keep burying his past under more layers of denial and wealth, and in doing so, teach his son the ultimate lesson, that the only way to deal with pain and guilt is to hide from it, to outrun it until you die. Or he could do the one thing he had never done in his entire insulated life. He could turn around and face the consequences of his actions, head on, without flinching. The choice was terrifying. It meant the end of everything he had built, the gleeful destruction of his reputation by the media he so despised, the certain loss of his freedom. It meant facing the raw, unfiltered hatred of the woman he had wronged in the most profound way imaginable. But the alternative, a lifetime of looking into his son's clear, knowing eyes and seeing the reflection of a coward and a fraud, was a prison of a different, more terrible kind. A prison for the soul. He gripped the steering wheel, the leather groaning under his tight grip. "Daniel," he said, his voice hoarse, cracking with the weight of his decision. "We have to go back." The drive back to the corner booth was the longest of Alistair's life. Every mile was a war fought within himself, between the ingrained instinct for self-preservation and the new, terrifying imperative for confession. When he pulled into the parking lot, the diner was quieter, the lunchtime rush having given way to the late afternoon lull. He could see Lena through the window, wiping down a table, her movements weary and mechanical. He took a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it was his last as a free man. He wheeled Daniel to the door, then stopped, his hand on the cool metal of the push bar. "Son," he said, his voice cracking, "I need you to wait here for a minute. There's something I have to do, alone." Daniel looked at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a dawning fear. But he saw the resolve in his father's face, a look he had never seen before. He nodded slowly. Alistair walked into the diner. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that now seemed to toll for him. Lena looked up, and a guarded, weary expression fell over her face. "I forgot something," she said, her tone flat, defensive, clearly assuming he was there to argue or insult her further. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did." He walked to her table, his legs feeling like they were moving through wet cement. He didn't know where to begin, how to utter the words that would detonate both of their lives. There was no script for this, no protocol. He just knew he had to. "Lena," he started, his throat tight, his mouth dry. "The accident. The one that took your son." She stiffened, her body going rigid, her eyes narrowing with suspicion and pain. "What about it?" "The black sedan," he choked out, the words tasting like ash and bile in his mouth. "The custom model, the driver they never found." He looked at her, his face a mask of raw, undisguised anguish, and let the silence hang in the air. A silent, terrible, and absolute confession. He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, then the slow, dawning, horrifying realization. Her hand went to her mouth, a gasp catching in her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving it a ghostly white. The cleaning rag she was holding slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft, final thud. "It was you," she whispered, her voice filled with a dawning, soul-shattering horror that was worse than any scream. "It was you." The world seemed to stop. The quiet hum of the soda refrigerator, the distant clatter of a plate in the kitchen, it all ceased. There was only the sound of Lena's ragged, shallow breathing and the frantic, guilty hammering of Alistair's own heart. He had confessed. He had laid his soul bare. And now he stood before the judge, jury, and executioner he had created all those years ago on that dark, rainy highway, and waited for his sentence. The word "yes" was a shard of glass in Alistair's throat. He couldn't force it out. The confession had taken all his strength. He could only stand there, his carefully constructed world collapsing into dust and ruin around him, and give a single, sharp, damning nod. Lena stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream that had been building inside her for a decade. Her eyes, which had held such profound sadness, now blazed with a fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look that stripped him bare, that saw through the expensive suit and the powerful facade to the rotten, cowardly core of the man he was. "Get out," she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage so potent, so intense, it was terrifying to witness. "Get out." He didn't move. He couldn't. He was rooted to the spot by the sheer force of her loathing. He deserved this. He deserved so much more. "Lena, Don't you say my name!" she spat, her voice rising, cracking with pain. "You don't have the right. You monster! You killed my baby, my sweet, innocent baby, and you just drove away?" The last words were a choked sob, a sound of such profound, bottomless agony that it physically hurt to hear. The diner's manager, a burly, balding man named Sal, came rushing out from the kitchen, a spatula in his hand. "Is everything all right here, Lena? Is this man bothering you?" Lena didn't take her eyes off Alistair, her gaze a physical weapon. "Call the police, Sal," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Call them right now. I want to report a hit and run." Alistair didn't protest. He simply stood there, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, waiting for the inevitable. This was it. The end of his life as he knew it. He saw the manager fumbling for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, and a strange, unexpected sense of peace settled over him. It was the peace of surrender, the quiet calm that comes when the long, exhausting, internal fight is finally over. But then, his gaze drifted past Lena, through the large, greasy plate glass window, and he saw Daniel. His son was watching, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that Alistair had never seen before. It wasn't just fear for his father's impending arrest. It was a deeper, more primal fear of abandonment, of being left alone in a world that he couldn't navigate by himself. And in that moment, Alistair knew that simply going to prison wasn't enough. That was the easy way out. It was a passive acceptance of his fate, a punishment that would, in its own way, absolve him. Redemption wasn't about punishment. It was about atonement, and atonement required action. It required a living penance. "Wait," he said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. He looked at Lena, not with the arrogance of a man trying to buy his way out of trouble, but with the raw, soul-deep desperation of a man pleading for his very soul. "Going to jail won't bring him back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It won't change what I did. It won't undo a single second of your pain. But maybe I can do something. For you, for his memory." Lena laughed, a harsh, bitter, ugly sound that held no humor, only 10 years of curdled grief. "Do something? What could you possibly do? Write me a check? Is that how you fix everything, Mr. Blackwood? You throw your dirty money at it until it goes away?" "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "Not with money. With my life. My entire life." He made her a promise, a vow, right there in the middle of the diner, with the threat of police sirens hanging in the air. He would not just turn himself in. He would first unravel the life he had built on that lie. He would liquidate his assets, sell his companies, dismantle his entire empire, and put every last penny into a foundation in her son's name, the Leo Miller Foundation. It would help families with disabled children, families who were struggling the way she must have struggled, the way he, in his own privileged, ignorant way, was struggling now. He would dedicate the rest of his existence, whether it was from a jail cell or not, to honoring the life he had so carelessly, so callously destroyed. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a deal. It was a vow, a sacred oath. Lena stared at him, her chest heaving, her mind reeling. The raw sincerity in his voice, the utter, devastating brokenness in his eyes, it was something she couldn't immediately dismiss. The man standing before her was not the same arrogant monster who had walked in an hour ago. He was a man drowning in his own guilt, desperately reaching for a life raft. She didn't agree. She didn't forgive him. She simply said, her voice cold as ice, "Do it." And then, when there is nothing left of the man you were, you will walk into a police station and you will confess. And I will be there to watch. It was a sentence and a reprieve, all in one. The weeks that followed were a blur of frenzied, desperate activity for Alistair. He was true to his word. He began the systematic, brutal dismantling of his empire, piece by piece. His lawyers thought he was having a psychotic break. His business partners screamed at him over the phone, calling him a traitor and a fool. He ignored them all, moving with the relentless focus of a man on a holy mission. The process was a brutal, humbling, and profound education. He met with the families who would benefit from the foundation, listened to their stories of struggle, financial ruin, and resilience, and saw in their tired, hopeful faces the echoes of Lena's pain. He learned more about humanity and compassion in those few weeks than he had in 50 years of ruthless acquisition. He didn't see Lena. Their only communication was through a shell-shocked team of lawyers, but he felt her presence in everything he did. She was the ghost at every board meeting, the silent observer at every transaction. Her son, Leo, a boy he had never met, became more real to him than most of the living people he knew. He also started spending real, quality time with Daniel. He fired the nurses, much to their surprise and his son's quiet delight. He took over Daniel's care himself. It was clumsy and frustrating at first, a slow, awkward dance of trial and error. But he learned. He learned the infinite patience required to help Daniel dress, the specific way to cut his food so he wouldn't choke, the subtle cues in his slurred speech that signaled his needs. He learned to listen. Truly listen. Not with impatience, but with a deep, abiding love that he had never before allowed himself to fully express. And in caring for his own son, in the quiet, intimate moments of daily life, he began, in some small, agonizing way, to understand the true depth of Lena's loss. Every small victory with Daniel, a shared laugh over a spilled drink, a sentence clearly spoken, a moment of shared understanding, was a painful, stabbing reminder of all the thousands of moments that had been stolen from Lena and Leo. His redemption wasn't a grand gesture. It was a slow, agonizing, and deeply personal transformation, built one small, humble, painful act at a time. He was becoming the father he should have been, not to erase his past, but to honor the boy whose future he had so selfishly taken. The day finally came when the last paper was signed, the last asset transferred. The Blackwood Empire, a titan of global finance, was no more. In its place was the Leo Miller Foundation, a multi-million-dollar charity, a permanent institution dedicated to providing advanced medical care and holistic support for children with severe physical disabilities. Alistair was left with nothing but a modest, carefully managed trust fund for Daniel's future care and the clothes on his back. He stood before a mirror in the empty, cavernous hall of his once grand mansion, the walls now bare, the floors echoing with his footsteps. The house had been sold to a tech billionaire who planned to tear it down. The man looking back at him in the dusty mirror was a stranger. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness that had settled into his bones. The sharp, predatory glint in his eyes had softened into something that looked unnervingly like humility. He looked, he thought, like a man who had finally been defeated. His lawyer had arranged the final meeting. Lena was waiting for him in a small, sterile, anonymous conference room in a downtown office building. She was there to receive the final paperwork for the foundation. And he was there to fulfill the last, crucial part of his promise. He walked into the room, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Lena sat at the far end of a long, polished table, her back ramrod straight. She looked different, too. The raw exhaustion was still there, etched into the fine lines around her eyes, but there was a new strength in her gaze, a new, quiet sense of purpose. They didn't speak. Words were inadequate. He simply walked to the table and slid the thick folder of documents across the polished wood. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages with a practiced, dispassionate air. For 10 long minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft, crisp rustle of paper. When she was finished, she closed the folder and placed her hands on top of it. "It's done," she said, her voice devoid of any discernible emotion. "You did what you said you would do." "Yes," Alistair replied, his voice hoarse. "Now, it's time for me to finish my end of the bargain." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was his written confession, detailed and damning, every word a nail in his own coffin. "I'm on my way to the police station now." He expected her to nod, to dismiss him with a cold glare, to finally let the full weight of the law fall upon him. But she didn't. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable, her gaze intense. "Before you go," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "there's something you need to see." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn, scuffed, leather-bound photo album. She opened it and pushed it across the table toward him. The first picture was of a smiling, red-faced baby with a shock of black hair wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. "That's Leo," she said softly. "The day we brought him home from the hospital." Alistair looked at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. He turned the page with a trembling hand. Leo as a toddler, covered in mud, taking his first wobbly steps. Leo on his first day of school, his oversized backpack almost as big as he was, a nervous smile on his face. Page after page of a life lived, a life full of joy, laughter, and light. And then, the pictures changed. The tone shifted. Leo in a hospital bed, his small body hooked up to a terrifying tangle of wires and tubes. Leo in a wheelchair, a faint, brave, heartbreaking smile on his face. The images were a testament to a mother's unending love and a little boy's incredible, stubborn resilience. Alistair felt the tears welling in his eyes, hot and shameful. This was the life he had destroyed. This was the vibrant, beautiful soul he had extinguished on a dark, rainy night, and then forgotten about. He turned to the last page, his heart aching. He was expecting another picture of Leo, perhaps the last one ever taken. But it wasn't. It was a picture of a woman, a young, smiling woman with dark, familiar eyes and a sad, gentle smile. She was standing in front of a hospital, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Alistair frowned, his mind clouded with confusion. "Who is this?" Lena took a deep, shuddering breath. "That's me," she said, "and that's Leo." She pointed to a man standing beside her in the photo, his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a proud, beaming, exhausted smile on his face. He was a young man, handsome and kind-eyed, dressed in a doctor's scrubs. "And that," she said, her voice breaking on the last word, "is my husband, Dr. David Miller. He was a pediatric surgeon at the city hospital." Alistair stared at the photo, a cold, sickening dread creeping up his spine, a feeling far worse than the fear of prison. He didn't understand. "The night of the accident," Lena continued, her voice a raw, ragged whisper that seemed to be torn from her very soul. "David was on his way home from a 24-hour shift. He had just performed a life-saving 8-hour surgery on a little girl. He was a hero, but he was tired. So tired. He fell asleep at the wheel. He drifted into the oncoming lane. The world seemed to tilt and spin, the floor dropping out from under him." Alistair looked up from the photo, his eyes wide with a wild, desperate disbelief. "What are you saying?" "The black sedan," Lena said, the tears now streaming down her face, a silent, steady cascade of grief. "The car my son was in. It wasn't you who hit him, Alistair. It was him who hit you." The confession, the one he had clutched in his hand like a key to his own damnation, felt like a lead weight. The memory of that night, so vivid and terrifying, was a lie. A story he had told himself to make sense of the chaos, the jolt, the thud. It had been the other car, the one that had swerved without warning into his path. He hadn't been a drunken hit-and-run driver. He had been a victim. He had panicked, yes. He had run, yes. A coward's act. But he wasn't a killer. "The police report," he stammered, his mind racing, trying to rearrange the pieces of his shattered reality. They said it was a hit-and-run because you drove away," Lena said, her voice filled with a grief that spanned a decade. They found my husband's car. They found my son. But they never found the other driver. I've spent all these years hating a phantom, a faceless, wealthy monster in a black sedan. I never knew. Until that day in the diner, when you told me about the car, I never knew it was you. The revelation was a final, devastating twist of the knife. His guilt, the very engine that had driven his painful, arduous transformation, was a phantom of his own making. The entire foundation of his redemption was built on a terrible, tragic, and profound misunderstanding. He hadn't destroyed her life. Their lives had simply, horrifically collided, two ships lost in a storm, leaving a wreckage that had defined them both for a decade. He looked at Lena, at the woman he thought he had wronged so terribly, and saw not an accuser, but a fellow survivor, trapped in the same tragic story. And in her eyes, he saw not hatred, but a deep, shared, and inconsolable sorrow. The silence in the conference room was profound, a sacred space heavy with the weight of two lives irrevocably altered by a single, tragic moment on a dark highway. Alistair looked at the confession in his hand, the paper now seeming flimsy and meaningless. The ink a testament to a fiction he had constructed out of fear and shame. He had been so ready, so willing to accept his punishment, to pay for a crime he hadn't committed. The guilt had been a shield, a way to make sense of the senseless, to give his son's own tragedy a dark, karmic meaning. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper that was barely audible in the quiet room. "Why let me do all this? Why let me believe I was a monster?" Lena took a long time to answer. She traced the edge of the photo album with her finger, her gaze distant, lost in the landscape of her own painful memories. "Because at first," she said, her voice low and honest, "I wanted you to suffer. When you confessed in the diner, I felt a satisfaction so dark and venomous it scared me. It felt like justice. I wanted you to feel even a fraction of the pain I've felt every single day for the past 10 years. I wanted you to tear down your life, just as mine was torn down in an instant." She looked up, and her eyes, cleared now of hatred, met his. But then, I started to see the reports from the Foundation's lawyers. I read the letters from the families you were helping, families on the brink of collapse. I saw the pictures of children who were getting a chance at a life, a chance at some small joy, a life my Leo never had. And I saw you in the background of a photo from a charity event, helping Daniel out of his chair. You looked different. The man in that photo wasn't a monster. He was just a father, a tired, sad, but dedicated father. She pushed the photo album back into her bag, closing a chapter of her life. "My husband was a good man," she continued, her voice soft but firm, a quiet eulogy. "He made a mistake, a terrible, fatal mistake, and he paid for it with his life. I've spent a decade drowning in grief and anger, looking for someone to blame. It was easier to hate a faceless villain than to accept the random, cruel meaninglessness of it all. But blame doesn't heal. It just poisons. It poisons everything." Alistair felt the carefully constructed walls of his own narrative crumble to dust. His guilt, his redemption, it had all been a story he told himself. The truth was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more tragic. There were no villains in this story, only victims. "What you did," Lena said, her voice gaining a new, hard-won clarity, "was born from a lie you told yourself. But the good that came from it, that's real. The children who will be helped by Leo's foundation, their lives will be better because of what you did. You may have started this journey for the wrong reasons, Alistair, but you became a different man along the way. Maybe that's the only kind of redemption that matters." She stood up, her movements graceful and resolute. "I can't forgive you. Not for driving away. Not for leaving my husband and my son on the side of that road. That is a truth you have to live with for the rest of your life. And I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for the years I spent letting hatred consume me. But maybe we can stop punishing each other. And ourselves. She walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the handle. What will you do now? Alistair looked at his hands, no longer the hands of a titan of industry that signed billion-dollar deals, but the hands of a man who had learned to patiently button his son's shirt. He thought of the long, quiet evenings he now spent with Daniel, not filling the silence with the noise of television, but with conversation, with reading, with simply being present. I'm going to be a father, he said, the words feeling more real and substantial than any title or accolade he had ever held. I'm going to take my son fishing. He's always wanted to go fishing. A faint, sad but genuine smile touched Lena's lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile without the heavy shadow of grief behind it. Leo loved fishing, she said softly. And then she was gone. Alistair didn't go to the police station. His confession was a lie, and a true one would only heap more pain onto Lena's life, tarnishing the memory of the husband she had loved. His penance would not be a jail cell. It would be a life of quiet service, of honoring the memory of a boy he never knew by cherishing the son he had almost lost in his own pride and fear. He walked out of the office building and into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than he had in years. The crushing weight of his phantom guilt was gone, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow, but also by a fragile, tentative hope. He hadn't earned forgiveness. He hadn't found absolution, but he had stumbled, blindly and accidentally, into something far more valuable. He had found his own humanity. Months later, on a still, misty morning, a small boat drifted on the placid surface of a quiet lake. Alistair watched as Daniel, with a new, powered reel he had designed for him, expertly cast a line into the water. The boy's face, usually a mask of frustration, was calm and focused, lit with a quiet joy. He looked over at his father and smiled, a wide, clear, unambiguous smile. Alistair smiled back. It was a simple image, a world away from the life of power and prestige he had once craved. But for the first time, it felt like enough. It felt like everything. The road ahead was long, and the past would always be a passenger, a quiet ghost in the back seat. But it was no longer his destination. It was just the place he had started from.